I feel like we as gamers need to address the very real fact that the numbers that these game companies are releasing are obviously fraudulent, right? I've talked a lot about how the PS2 numbers are fake and how games like Baldur's Gate 3 don't sell as well as initially reported. I've talked about how Kingdom Come Deliverance 2 selling 2 million units is not all that impressive. I've talked about how, the YouTube community downplays games like Mario and Luigi Brothers Ship. In 2023, we had to deal with people like trying to gaslight us into thinking Tears of the Kingdom bombed at 20 million units sold. That Super Mario Bros. Wonder bombed at at its sales numbers, right? So there's definitely this weird active agenda to try and manipulate numbers, to try and make them look more or less impressive, depending on what they are and who's doing the reporting, right? Lots of Twitter people came forward and tried to tell us that like Mario and Luigi Brothership bombed, and now we have like the actual numbers, and we know that it didn't, right? That is just one example. But there are definitely like blatant blatant examples of this that are so far beyond what we typically see that they do really need to be addressed. And I do think one of the most blatant examples of this is Pocket Pair's claims that Power World sold 32 million units, right? This is obviously not true at all, right? Power World doesn't have the resources. They haven't remained relevant. People aren't playing the game. It hasn't become some global phenomenon. And yet we're supposed to believe that Power World has outsold Pokemon at the height of Pokemania in the 90s, right? That it outsold Pokemon Red and Blue. Pokemon Red and Blue within like 5 years had like a successful TV series. It had the card game. It had like all of this stuff going for it. It had like its first wave of spin-offs, Pokemon Stadium, Pokemon Snap, stuff like that. Like Power World is like a year in and we've gotten like one major update that like added some new areas to like this blatantly unfinished game, and yet we're supposed to believe this is one of the big indie success stories over the past 10 years, right? Like this is bigger than Pokemon, is what Pocket Pair and its fanboys have been trying to tell us over the past year or so. And that is clearly not true when you just compare how what's happening now in the Pokemon world, when we've seen like the Pokemon TCG blow up the way it did, when we saw like Pokemon Legends EA is on the way out, when we've seen like how well Scarlet and Violet have done, right? Like the idea that people had that Pokemon was having some kind of downfall or was becoming irrelevant or isn't competitive has been demonstrated to be completely and totally false, right? And then meanwhile, you have this narrative that Power World is this huge unprecedented success that people love and people want to see more of and people want to support, and yet it just doesn't get talked about at all outside of the plagiarism allegations, right? The only time people talk about Power World at all is when they're trying to downplay what Pokemon is doing, right? That's it. That's the only time this is really relevant, is that it's just something for people to use against Pokemon. And that's been true since the very beginning, but it's especially blatant now that they're claiming that they've outsold like the best-selling Pokemon games ever, now that they're claiming that there's some huge that the numbers are unrealistic is what we're seeing here in regards to this release. Like we've seen how the claims that this game is some huge hit have just kind of fallen apart. You can look at YouTubers playing the game now. It's not some major hit with streamers or the like. It's not some hotly discussed thing. It's not popular. Is with It's all very very clearly observable in this sphere. This idea that Power World was some huge giga hit that has Nintendo scared was always just like a gigantic cope. Especially at this stage, now that the lawsuit is well underway and the game is going to be taken down anyway. So I I find myself really wondering just how much how long the industry can keep up this farce. This idea that games like Power World are like bigger and better than what Nintendo puts out. Because we saw this with Celeste when that came out, right? The narrative was that like this is better than 2D Mario platformers. This is some huge deal. Hollow Knight was like this. It's better than Metroid, right? Every time these like small knockoff like Nintendo games come out and like get a lot of praise and get a lot of hype and get some attention, right? Like the developers are never able to replicate the success. Undertale is probably a really good example of this. A straight up plagiarized version of Earthbound, Cave Story, a bunch of other like classic games, got all this attention, all this hype, was worshipped by a lot of people, is completely irrelevant in 2025, right? Like this is the reality of the indie game scene is that just because you put out one game that catches on for superficial reasons, that doesn't necessarily mean you'll be able to replicate that success. And I think Pocket Pair is demonstrating that very well in that they won't be able to put out any new projects. They won't be able to finish the project they've actually put out, and that project is not nearly as successful or popular as they want you to believe, right? Pow World is in a position where they absolutely cannot charge people anything more than what they've already have because it's just going to antagonize what few fans they have, and people aren't going to be doing damage control for this game forever. The instant they do anything shady or underhanded or do it more openly, I should say, people are going to turn on them, and we are starting to see that more and more often. Um, as this situation develops. Back in the day, people actually believed these sales numbers. People thought they were actually real. But, looking at it now, like, 32 million players, like seeing their terrible like JPEG announcement superimposed on like nobody believes this. Like 32 million units sold. Like really, I you can't even afford to like hire someone to make like a neater looking infographic. You just use the same card but just update it with like higher and higher numbers. Like I have a very hard time believing that anything that Pocket Pair says or does is legitimate, and I do think that this does need to be acknowledged in the community going